For more than 30 years, the Australia Institute has been producing research that matters. But how do you turn big, bold ideas into positive change? In this series, I'm speaking to some of Australia's best thinkers about how we can make change for the better. I'm Paul Barclay, and this is What's the Big Idea, brought to you by the Australia Institute. Today, I'm talking to Polly Hemming. Polly is Director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program. She's previously worked in academic publishing, remote Indigenous education, refugee advocacy and science communication. Hello, Polly.
Hey, Paul. How you going?
Very well. Polly, you believe that caution is killing us. You're referring there to overly cautious political responses to the raft of big problems that we face. In which areas do we especially need to see more bravery demonstrated, do you think?
So despite being one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and we're called the lucky country for a reason. I won't finish that rest of that quote, but we are very lucky in Australia. We're an incredibly rich country. We have clean water, clean air, a distinct lack of armed conflict, but we've also got some inexcusably big problems. We've got a wealth gap that's rapidly widening. 69% of Australian kids live in poverty. The rate of women being murdered by men is increasing. We have kids living in tents, and then that's sort of just the beginning of the societal problems. And then, of course, we've got ecosystem collapse that Australia is experiencing. We talk about this existential threat of climate change. It's just a sanitised way of describing death, really. We're literally, as the rest of the global community is, in the fight for our lives, and it's not hyperbole. We've got the direct impacts of climate change being felt in Australia right now. Fires, extreme heat, flooding. Climate change is affecting the cost of living. It affects whether we can get insurance or not. I think you get the picture. But if we've got these really big problems, they need big structural solutions. They need a willingness to break and rebuild, not incrementalism or making tweaks to existing policy.
And that's what's striking to me is frequently the rhetoric from governments is to acknowledge that, yes, these problems are big and that we really need to do something about them. And then the response is often a bit of a damp squib. As you say, that incremental change. We've got this big problem, but this will do for the time being. It's strangely complacent. Where do you think, though, the fear of being courageous, if that's what it is coming from? What's driving that?
I think it depends who you're talking about, really. I think caution characterises progressive politics, and I think that fear comes from being accused of economic recklessness or fiscal negligence, and a fear that has come about as a result of the past. 75% of Australians, for example, want a polluter pays tax in Australia, which is basically a carbon tax. But there's no way anyone in Australia is going to use the words carbon tax, even though it's good policy and it's bold policy. It's sensible policy. So I think there is that fear, but at the same time, I think Australians are afflicted by not wanting to have a fight. No one wants to have a fight, or the people that do want to have a fight are usually crazy. Humans are naturally conflict averse, whether it's in politics or in our daily lives. And there's a real distaste for conflict. Even debating ideas is now being conflated with personal attacks. And I think the irony is, as our nation's prosperity is increased, complacency and caution has taken the place of boldness and bravery and a willingness to fight out an idea. And that's with good reason, like with the intensification of neoliberalism, which is neoliberalism and authoritarianism, I'd say, in Australia over the last 30 years, our leaders, increasingly scared themselves, which is what I was referring to before, have taught Australians to be scared. Think about how well fear is such a powerful motivator. You should be scared of power, scared of refugees, scared of losing franking credits, even if you don't know what franking credits are. Scared of wind farms, scared of African gangs, scared of being put in jail for being a whistleblower, and overwhelmingly, I think, scared that more for others means less for us. If we were to help out those dole bludgers, if we were to increase welfare, well, that's taking money away from good, hardworking people. And I'm saying that in inverted commas, I should say. And actually, it's the greatest threats are not those things. It's the fear, incrementalism, and low expectations. And I think that aversion to discomfort or conflict that are the greatest threat to all of us.
Well, yes, the fear that was able to be whipped up over a non-binding advisory committee for Indigenous Australians, for example. Vastly disproportionate amount of fear that was able to be constructed relative to what the actual proposal was. There are examples everywhere. You named plenty of them. But, one of the things that strikes me is, and I know that there's a risk about looking backwards and seeing it as some good old days era, but redistribution and fairness via, say, a more progressive tax system, more affordable housing, a better social wage, free university education, these were once features of social and economic policy in Australia not that long ago, but they've been diluted or eliminated, it would seem to me, as you say, at the altar of neoliberalism. At the same time, though, the CEOs that run these large corporations and institutions, they can earn considerable amounts of money even if they diminish service delivery and even if the corporations they run are not terribly effectively run. It's an interesting it's an interesting split there, and I wonder whether, in even talking about the need to be courageous, we need to actually think about neoliberalism itself, rethinking that as before we can even get to the stage where politicians can act with a degree of courage.
I think that's a really good point. And, you just referred to economic policy. So we all like to think that we act based on pragmatism and level-headedness. Things must be done according to a cost-benefit analysis. And that's how so much of our policy is justified because of the economics of it. Humans don't behave that way. Humans do what they want and they do what they think is right. And then you usually retrofit an economic justification to it, if that makes sense. If you look at the most successful policies in Australia, they've been done on the basis of a moral justification. I don't know if that makes sense, but no one remembers Gough Whitlam for his cost-benefit analysis or the economic modelling he commissioned. And I'm talking about both sides of politics here. So I think the Albanese government and Labor governments in the past have done really brave, bold things in Australia and internationally, but they've never done it on the basis that it was fiscally responsible. They did it because it was the right thing to do. If you look at the coalition, for better or for worse, their ideas, they might be batshit crazy, they might be really dangerous and harmful, but they've implemented those ideas on the basis that it was the right thing to do. So where I'm going with this is sort of we're all so caught up in the economic justification of things, but actually people do things because they think they're right. So, in my essay, I talk about John Howard, and I'm not saying he didn't go on to inflict significant harm on our country, but after the Port Arthur shooting massacre in Tasmania, John Howard implemented far-reaching gun reform in Australia because it was the right thing to do. Like, he simply decided after the Port Arthur massacre that Australia needed urgent firearm laws, and he knew it was going to be hard. He was faced with threats. He fought people, but did it on the moral basis. When the coalition introduced really aggressive and punitive and expensive and ineffective, I should say, border protection policies, they pretended it was because it was the right thing to do. Maybe Tony Abbott believed it was the right thing to do. He said it was, a decent and humane act. When you referred to The Voice before, when Anthony Albanese talked about a voice to Parliament, it was because it was the right thing to do. The biggest changes in policy and in our society are done on the basis of morality.
Yeah, and there's plenty of examples of that. The end to whaling is another good example, the introduction of anti-discrimination laws in Australia. But I think you're referring really to having the courage of your convictions, and you're suggesting that one does not need to share the conviction to see that there is some courage involved in it. I would have thought the GST is another example. It may have been a regressive form of taxation, arguably, but it required a considerable degree of courage politically to introduce it. And John Howard believed in it and was prepared to take what was actually a brave step. And it strikes me, and I don't know whether this is being unfair, it strikes me that we are seeing more of that courage coming from the Conservative side. I mean, at the moment, you've got Peter Dutton advocating nuclear power, for example. Let's set aside the merits of that. But that wouldn't seem to be a safe political suggestion to make, whereas on the Labor side, it does seem to be rather incremental.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Fossil fuels are killing people, and they're going to kill many more. And you'd think that would be enough of a reason for someone to stand up and say, okay, we're going to stop approving new gas and coal mines because these things are directly linked to deaths. In the same way that our government, Albanese government, is banning stone bench tops because they're killing people. We don't like to kill people. We don't need an economic reason to do it. We don't need to justify it with economic modelling. I think you're right. While progressive side of politics talks about the economic opportunities of climate action and how many jobs will be created, there's a need to justify it economically. This won't cost us. This will be lucrative for everyone. And then you have the coalition unapologetically standing up and proposing the reintroduction of state energy ownership and spending $600 billion of taxpayers' money on nuclear without any economic justification. And what I was going to mention before is that when John Howard introduced the gun buyback scheme, he introduced a tax. This is a man who virtually worships at the altar of neoliberalism, and he introduced a tax to pay for gun buybacks, and people went along with it because it was the right thing to do, because it was going to save lives.
You often hear it said that we can't afford to do this. We can't afford universal dental care. We can't afford free university education. In Victoria at the moment, some are saying we can't afford the new suburban rail link. All of these are examples that I'd have thought are popular. How much of a constraint is money or debt on doing the right thing, on good policy?
Well, it was Josh Frydenberg who said anything's affordable if it's a priority, and that was in relation to spending how many hundreds of billions of dollars on submarines. Australia is the world's 13th largest economy. We've got a GDP about the size of Russia's. Yeah, we're spending $400 billion on submarines we'll probably never get. Our funding for defence war toys will reach about $760 billion over this decade. The idea that we don't have money is ridiculous. We have so much money, yet we have kids, as I said, we have kids living in tents, in Australia. When our governments say they can't afford things, it just means they don't want to spend the money on them. To use the environment as an example. So Australia is in a pretty bad place when it comes to its environmental track record, and our ecosystems are officially deteriorating and in decline. That was in the State of the Environment report. The cost of restoring and protecting the environment has been placed variously at $2 billion a year. One estimate, it puts it at $16 billion a year. This is not a lot when you consider that state and federal governments spend $14 billion in the last year on fossil fuel subsidies. $10 billion a year goes to the actual things causing ecosystem collapse. And the current government, Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek, has said we can't afford to restore and protect the environment alone, and has opened it up to the private sector has to step in, and we need markets to help do this. But there's a strong irony in the government claiming it can't afford to fund conservation without private capital, while it's directly subsidising the expansion of industries like gas and coal, which are contributing to the climate and biodiversity crisis.
So, I'm trying to think here of what the barriers might be toward courageous policy, or what governments might argue the barriers are. Are the solutions to climate change, inequality, our other major problems, are they simply too complex? Is that a barrier to action?
It's funny you say that. We're always told that the most obvious policy solutions are naive and wildly unrealistic, and that it will take time to reduce emissions and turn this big cruise ship around. We actually don't have time. The physics isn't going to wait. We're told we can't afford to spend money, and how critical certain industries are to our economy, to regional security. And then we're led to believe that when it comes to climate, the solutions lie in these really elaborate and innovative profit-maximising financing mechanisms that no one ever really understands, and you never question stuff that you don't understand. But there's never any discussion of just, we're going to stop doing the bad stuff. And that's what it comes down to.
So you're referring there, I think, to the whole offset rort, if I can use that term, whereby you continue to emit CO2 into the atmosphere, but you offset it in a kind of accounting way by saying that, we're still emitting carbon to keep all of these factories going and to keep the Australian economy ticking over, but it's okay because we're protecting these tracts of rainforest in Indonesia, and all of those trees act as a sink that sucks in all of the carbon that we've pumped into the environment. But as you know, because you've done a lot of research in this, that's not actually what's happening at all.
Yeah, that's a really good example. That's one of those things where we don't even need to have a conversation about ending fossil fuels, because we can have a great conversation about markets and offsets. And this is a really complicated, opaque mechanism to distract from ending fossil fuels. Carbon capture and storage is another one, all sorts of technocratic solutions and markets and stuff, but it's actually not complicated. Stop doing bad stuff. Our governments know this. You mentioned whaling before. It was stopped in most of the world because it was cruel and unnecessary. Asbestos was banned in Australia because it was killing people. Bob Hawke just said we're not going to mine Antarctica. So there's a lot of excuses made, and things are made really complicated, and humans actually have this kind of little glitch in their brain where we prefer the most complicated solution to things. I can't remember the name of it now, but we always opt for the most complicated solution because it just couldn't be as simple as ending fossil fuel subsidies. It actually is.
I'm Paul Barclay. I'm talking to Polly Hemming, Director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program. She's contributed a chapter to What's the Big Idea?, an anthology of big ideas put together by the Australia Institute. You can purchase it right now. It also features chapters by Michael Kirby, Peter Doherty, Louise Adler, Fiona Stanley, and many other leading thinkers. Solutions to our big challenges, they exist, as we're discussing right now. We just need the courage to implement them. What's the Big Idea is available online from the Australia Institute website. I was wondering, Polly, advocating for bold policy requires skillful communication and advocacy, the likes of which some of our prime ministers in the past had. The ability to tell a story to people about why certain changes are needed and what the benefits are of those changes. I wonder whether this is lacking somewhat in today's leaders, that they don't actually have the confidence that they'll be able to convince people that this is a good and necessary idea.
That's really interesting. I think it's much easier to tell a story, and it's much easier to be convincing when you mean what you say and you're not trying to say one thing while doing another. And when it comes to climate change, the current government is still subsidising and endorsing and approving fossil fuel expansion while telling voters it's acting on climate change and taking climate change seriously. Those are two fundamentally contradictory things. If you are trying to tell a story, you're going to tie yourself up in knots with a cover story, essentially. Like go and have a look at the Climate Change Authority's website. This is the independent body that advises the Australian government on climate change. It's hilarious. The prevarication and backtracking, and it's like ChatGPT wrote it with the prompts. Talk about taking climate action while expanding fossil fuels. Gas executives are actually more compelling than gas executives pretending to take climate action, because they're just telling one story. And I don't know if you've got kids, but if you guys have ever heard your kids try and tell a story when you know they're lying, they're all over the shop. And so trying to tell many different audiences many different stories with one narrative is almost impossible, and that's why you will never have a clear and compelling case. If someone is not trying to hide anything and actually has conviction and is not trying to appease anyone, if you listen to some of our independents talk, David Pocock, for example, speaks with clarity. He's simple to understand because his message is clear, and he's essentially not trying to appease anyone with it. And I know he's a rugby player, but when you're playing a straight bat, communication is easy.
At the moment, the Canberra discourse is around a cost of living problem, inflation, interest rates, as distinct from an inequality problem. The latter suggests something temporary that will be cured when inflation and interest rates come down. The former suggests something structural that needs significant government intervention to deal with it. Do you agree that that's partly why we've seen the framing of this around basically cost of living rather than around a growth in inequality?
Yeah, you're right. If we talk about a cost of living crisis, it's sort of like this almost cosmic thing that, oh, no, none of us can do anything about this. It's cost of living, and it's a cost of living crisis, and fuck, maybe the market will, resolve itself, whatever that means as well. And it's a really great way of completely deflecting from greed, profit maximization, corporates being allowed to pursue profit maximization, and to deflect from the fact that governments could do so much to make life prosperous and livable for all Australians. We see this concentration of wealth by a few people who are just going to fight tooth and nail not to give that wealth up. It's governments who control the levers of what the private sector does. All of this is controllable. Markets are not these kind of magic things that sprout up.
Yeah, it's interesting. Standing up for the environment, standing up for the vulnerable, standing up for the collective over the individual, they run contrary to this notion of self-interest that politicians seem to assume that we prioritise. But if you look at Medicare, if you look at the NDIS, these are both founded on kind of altruistic and communitarian values. The idea that we should be able to provide healthcare and support for those who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford it themselves, even if we could afford it ourselves as individuals. I mean, there is evidence everywhere that we support initiatives that indicate we want governments to act altruistically rather than narrowly economically.
Yeah, and it goes. I mean, this is a biological issue. Altruism is actually a key to survival among species. You know, evolutionarily, we're told that, or neoliberalism has taught us to believe that we should all be pursuing individual wealth, and you know that's the most responsible way of looking after society if we all look after ourselves. But actually, biology and evolution shows that it's not just humans, but species thrive with altruism, that is looking after others. And there is a moral imperative, I think, and we all like to think that we like looking after others and we want to stop people from dying and we want to help those who are most vulnerable. But to look at it from a purely biological perspective, that's actually the best way to look after ourselves, is looking after others. You know, I'm sorry to kind of cast a clinical lens over it, but that's the most economically efficient and pragmatic way for us to protect ourselves and to thrive, is by looking after others. It's just there's this narrative that looking after others is actually irresponsible and rewards those who aren't working hard enough or don't want it bad enough or aren't dreaming big enough. It just doesn't stack up with the evidence and with the scientific evidence.
And just a final one, how do we stand up against the powerful media and vested interests and the high-profile industry figures who will oppose many of the reforms that we as citizens and that you have been advocating would like to see? What does that require?
I think firstly it requires recognising that these are just individuals. Yes, you know, lobbies like the Business Council of Australia or the Mining Council might have power, but ultimately it's just a few individuals at play here. So remembering that these are not omnipotent supernatural forces that we have no chance of standing up to, I think is a big part of the challenge. I don't actually think it's the power of these individuals or these vested interests. I think it's the weakness of our leaders and the erosion of accountability and transparency mechanisms in Australia. And of course, you know, if there's not much chance that the two major parties are going to fight to, you know, have whistleblower protections or protect the right to protest or have an act that actually works, an anti-corruption commission. But that's why independence and I think external pressure from the community is so important, because we need to protect and rebuild those institutions and those structures to make it much harder for those few individuals in government and outside government to be affecting the system so dramatically.
Good to talk to you, Polly. Thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Paul.
Polly Hemming is Director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program. The Australia Institute believes in big ideas and delivering research that matters, but we can't do it all alone. We need people like you who understand that real change doesn't come from playing it safe. That's why we're asking for your support. Sign up to our mailing list to get involved. And if you have the means, you can also donate to ensure we can keep fighting for a better, cleaner, fairer Australia. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.